Hi there, my name is Kjetil Haugen and I'm intending to give you some impressions of my research. I've always been a reluctant conference participant, and as such much of my work has never been properly presented on various scientific conferences. The reason for this is partly related to laziness, but maybe at least the latter years due to, should we say, bad health. I have a certain health problem that makes traveling a bit difficult for me. So this new way of using videos may seem like a sensible idea, and due to some local pressure I have decided to spend some time making some videos reflecting my research. The first one is related to doping. This subject has been an interesting subject for me for many years, and I published my first paper on the topic in 2004 in Journal Sports Economics. This actual idea for the paper is perhaps much older. I looked back on my computer and I saw that I actually gave an exam exercise on the topic back in 2001, and I seem to recall that I kind of used this in some lecturing at the PhD course in game theory at Norwegian Technical University in Trondheim back in the late 90s. So, I hope you enjoy my little presentation, and hopefully this will be a kind of start for more research presentations. Okay, let's start. We start by looking where to actually find the contents of this presentation. So let's fire up a browser here and search for academia.edu and my name. And then we, at the top here, get my name and my account, if you like, at academia.edu. If you enter this site, we find a lot of information here. Today we're going to talk about drugs, so look at some conference presentations here and go down, and here we see the performance enhancing drug game. You see that this was actually presented once in 2008 as an invited guest lecture at the Brno University of Technology in the Czech Republic. So let's open the document, hitting view, and maybe it's easier to open it with preview. We are using a Mac here, and go to full screen view when we conduct the presentation. So, of course, this is in Norwegian, so if you're not used to Norwegian Mac, you will probably be a bit confused perhaps, but hopefully you're able to see what I do. Okay, as it says here, the performance enhancing drug game was written by me. My address here and my email if you want to contact me on these matters. And it was published in Journal Sports Economics 2004, number 5, at pages 67 to 86. If we start talking about drugs, you can see on the left here some kind of clip from USA Today, where they say that 24 athletes were busted for drug-related violations immediately before the Olympics in Athens in 2004. The picture here of Sean Crawford is perhaps somewhat misleading, although he was actually busted in 2013. He got a 2-year ban, but according to himself he was kind of quitting athletics, so it wasn't really a big problem perhaps. The outline of my talk is on the right here, and I'll start by giving a very brief discussion on doping history and extent, and then I'll talk about the main point of this paper, the performance enhancing drug game. I'll talk a little bit about the Nash equilibria, how they are, what they may look like. At point 4, we will make some model assumption relaxations. This is kind of what we normally do when we do game theory. We start by building a relatively simple model, then may try to see what happens if we relax some of these kind of strong model assumptions, as we did initially. Finally, some conclusions and policy implications. Okay, doping history, what can we say? As it says here, it's an old phenomenon. It's actually normal back to the original Olympic Games in ancient Greece. So this is really not a new phenomenon. Some examples of some special, peculiar doping strategies. Strychnine was used for some time. A mix of brandy and cocaine has been used. But these latter years we've seen a kind of shift here from what it says here, a shift from proving existence of unnatural substances towards proving too high levels of natural substances. And of course this is kind of tricky, isn't it? In the old days you kind of added some artificial substance to the body to perform better. But that was kind of easy to discover. Okay, you can measure what is natural in the body, and then of course it's perhaps easy to measure what's not natural in the body. And there are certain hormones typically which are related to our body and impacts our performance. It could be our stamina or our strength typically. And especially these testosterone, growth hormones and blood levels are crucial. And if we can add substances that we cannot kind of track, but which has the effect that these natural hormones reach a level which improves our performance, then of course this is hard to find. So, what about doping extent? So how many people take drugs? According to sport officials, as it says here, there's been a significant improvement. Most people who deal with sports, they state that there's less doping now than before. But of course they have some incentives to do so, don't they? It's kind of sensible for them to give an impression that sports doping problems are reduced. You see here that there was only actually discovered 2 cases immediately before and during the Atlanta Olympic Games. There is something which is kind of obvious. We have seen there are certain performance decreases in certain sports. We have seen it in swimming. Although the latter years the world records have improved, there was a certain period where the kind of performance level of the athletes was not at the level it used to be some years before. In certain athletic events, for instance in shot put, maybe the best example, the world records set in the 1980s has kind of never reached the level afterwards. So there is some indication that at least certain types of doping has decreased. And of course finally there has been improved testing, so it's kind of easier or harder, you might guess, to get caught. On the other hand, of course, doping itself evolves, so certain people may reach situations where they are able to use substances which are not able to be tested. But as we say, in the end here, still, you have to recall the situation in Athens in 2004. There was actually 24 people caught. And a lot either caught before the games or simply not daring to enter. So this is kind of a blurred image. Some people would argue that doping has gone down. And I think, to be honest, that for certain events this is correct. We probably know that the extent of anabolic steroid use in certain classical athletics events like shot put, for instance, has gone down because they simply don't throw this bullet as long as they used to do. But we don't really know whether they take something else, do we? It could still be that to reach the level they actually have today, they have to use performance-enhancing drugs or doping. So it is really hard to say precisely whether it's going up or down. Okay, let's move on. Let's look at an alternative angle of doping extent. There was a kind of nifty little research which was done by Chicago Dr. Bob Goldman in 1988, where he asked 198 US athletes the following 2 questions. The first one was as follows. Given the choice of taking a drug with certain effect, meaning certain win, and no probability of being caught, of course underlying that there is still illegal to do this, what would you do? And of these 198 US athletes, actually 99% answered yes to this question. Question 2. If the same situation could be repeated over 5 consecutive years, but with a certain death caused by side effects after 5 years, will you still take the drug? And to some extent, surprisingly, more than 50% still answered yes to this question. This is kind of telling us that doping in sports may be deadly serious, to put it literally. Okay, a little bit on the drug research. Of course, this is a kind of an old presentation made back in 2004. Between now 2014 and 2004, there's 10 years, so there has been obviously been done a lot more on doping than what's actually been kind of referred to. But one of the three perhaps main works up to that point is a Norwegian work by Gunnar Breivik from 1987. He is kind of the first person who identified the prisoner's dilemma structure of doping, I think. There's also a work here referenced by Ebrent Paul. And perhaps up to that point, the most important work is the last one here by Berendsen in 2002, published in the European Journal of Political Economy. Of course, myself, including others, has done a lot of work after this time period. We will return to that in a later series, I presume. Okay, what do we do here? We look at this game theoretically, that's the main idea. So we have to make a game model. To make a game model, we have to make some assumptions, and on the left here, we start making some assumptions. Okay, we assume there are 2 athletes, and we make a strong assumption here. They are equally strengths, so they are kind of twins, if you like, or clones, so they are kind of acting precisely the same way when it comes to performing this sport. And they compete against each other in some kind of sport event. So we assume here at this point an obvious simplicity. First, that there are only 2 athletes competing. There are certain sports which kind of have this facility, a given football match, a boxing match. But there are other sports where there are more than 2 people competing. So the effect of kind of moving from 2 to more than 2 players is of course not looked at here. Again, we return to work where we actually look at that. And then we assume that the athlete's possible strategic choices are to use dope or not. Of course, this is a grave simplification. There are a lot of different drugs you can go for, some with strong effects but easier to be caught, others with weaker effects, less probability of getting caught and so on. So this is obviously again a very, very strong simplification. So we essentially we assume only one available drug. Furthermore, at this point, the drug is assumed effective. That is, if one agent takes the drug and the other does not, the drug taker wins the competition with certainty. So, we don't open up for the possibility that the drug could have an adverse effect. Of course, that can happen. You take too much steroids, you get sick, and you cannot actually compete. In that case, you have the adverse effect. So these kind of effects are kind of ruled out here. And of course, given assumption 1 here, then if there is a certain effect to the drug, then of course the guy who takes the drug, if the other doesn't, will win with certainty. Furthermore, it says here that the drug is also assumed to have equal effect on both athletes. Okay, and that doesn't seem like a big assumption or a grave assumption. It's if these 2 guys are clones, then of course it should kind of have the same effect, shouldn't it? So, of course, a kind of result of this assumption is that if both athletes then takes the drug, then again they are equal in strength. The drug has the same effect on both of them. They are originally the same, and of course they get the same. So they can competitively, there's kind of a probability of a half for any of them winning. And finally here, both agents must decide simultaneously. There is no kind of binding agreements allowed here. They have to make up their own mind before the competition on whether to take the drug or not. And this decision is made only once. I often refer to this as a one-shot game. Okay, some further assumptions here on the utility structure. We assume here that there is a certain A here, which is the price. So that is kind of what we earn or get utility-wise by winning the competition. And there is a losing utility option of 0. And there is a positive C here, so we kind of add or actually subtract some kind of effect if we get caught. Okay. So this W is that the agent wins the competition, the L is that the agent loses the competition, this epsilon is the rare occasion that an athlete is exposed as a drug abuser. Okay. Given these assumptions, we can formulate a game model, but there are a few more we have to look at. Okay, there must be a probability of being exposed as a drug abuser. We name that one R. And as it says here, this is assumed to be a nature call in this game. That is, both players know it and cannot in any way influence it, neither the value nor the actual test, which takes place after the competition. The probability of being used as a drug abuser if drugs are not used is assumed 0. So this option of being exposed as a drug abuser without taking drugs is kind of ruled out here. Of course, as you see, we keep on ruling out stuff here, so we end up with a kind of oversimplistic model. But as I said, we look at relaxing these oversimplifications later on. So we refer to this in our language here as a kind of perfect doping test. It means that it catches dopers who can be caught, but it does not miscatch dopers, actually non-dopers who shouldn't be caught. Furthermore, we assume for simplistic reasons that the payoff received by any agent is kept even if this agent is caught in doping. Of course, this is a crucial point, isn't it? Because if you get caught in doping, there must be some consequences. Traditionally, there has been limited consequences on actually retaking back money you have earned before you get caught. And that is what we kind of rule out here. Of course, there are some consequences when it comes to championships. If you win an Olympic gold medal and then you get caught, you have to deliver it back. Somebody else gets it. There's a kind of external effect as well here. And this kind of thing makes up complications when it comes to analyzing this. But other authors, researchers have looked at these situations after this work. So we may come back to it when we move on later on. And then finally, the standard assumption, if you don't want to look into incomplete information games, finally both agents know all there is to know, every assumption defined above, which we refer to as complete information here. Okay, given these assumptions, it's relatively straightforward to explain this matrix on the top right here. We can start at the bottom here with this square here. In this case, agent 1, which is one of the athletes, chooses Andy, which is not doping. The same for the others, so nobody takes drugs here in this situation. In that case, as our assumptions should indicate, there is no risk of being exposed as a drug user, so this cost C of being exposed is not present. And the only thing to do then is to kind of divide the prize money between these two equally strong athletes. So they, of course, each has a probability of half of winning. And if you like this half an A, then it's just simply computed by taking a probability of 0.5 times the price value of A. So we get half an A for each of the agents here. If we look at on the top floor, of course, the same thing happens with the positive part of the payoff. There's still half an A divided by each of them. No, they take drugs, so we have to subtract the expected cost of being exposed. Being exposed to the probability R, the cost is C, so then this constructs this half A minus RC for both of the agents. The final squares here, which is a kind of pooling strategy where one do not take drugs, the other takes drugs, or the other way around, taking drugs here and not taking drugs here for agent 1 and 2 is straightforward. If one of them takes drugs, if you look at the D and D situation, this route here, not route, this square here, then we immediately believe or understand that the player who does not take drugs, he will lose with certainty, so he will get nothing. He will not be exposed as a drug user, and he will not take any part of the prize. But in that case, the doper wins. Recall the assumptions, and he gets A with certainty. But of course the same expected cost of being exposed. Of course the other way around for this route. So that explains our extensive form of the game, so to speak, and there is some small calculations here just stating more stringently how this can be done. Okay, this is the game. We formulated it, we argued why it should be as it is. It heavily depends on our assumptions, of course. Now let's analyze it. Now, if we look for Nash equilibria here, we can look first on the left-hand side and keep an eye on the right-hand side here, which kind of contains the best replies for the players. The crucial assumption here is actually the sign of this term half A minus RC. We say the following here. It is reasonable to assume that half A minus RC should be positive. If half A minus RC is not positive, it's negative, then this best reply circle here is moving down there. This best reply is moving there, and these two are moving down and there. So then you get a non-doping equilibrium. So if a half times A minus RC actually is negative, if this inequality sign is reversed, then there will be no doping. We know that there is doping, so given that there is doping, we kind of need to assume this. Okay, so we make this assumption. Given this assumption, it's easy to see that by just adding half an A on each side of this inequality, as we do down here, we add half an A on the left-hand side, half an A on the right-hand side, and then we can take half an A plus half an A, which is a whole A, so it's A minus RC bigger than half A. And this means that by making this assumption, we can establish this best reply function, half A minus RC is bigger than 0. We can establish this best reply function, half A minus RC is bigger than 0 here. But we also get that A minus RC is bigger than half an A, meaning that this term is bigger than that term, and this term is bigger than that term. So there's only this single assumption that defines all best replies of this game. And as you can see, this game has a single, pure Nash equilibrium, the DD, meaning both athletes choose to take drugs. So the game theoretical prediction here is in the sense that everybody takes drugs, given that there are two players in this game. In a later research report, I will discuss the situation where we have more than two agents. And what might be surprising then is that the complexity increases tremendously. All kinds of different types of Nash equilibrium may pop up, and it's not as easy as this. So roughly you could say that the results we present here are kind of basically limited to the two-player situation. So they're kind of limited to certain types of sports. To be perfectly stringent and correct. Okay, some simple conclusions here. Everybody uses drugs, as we said. This DD is a unique Nash equilibrium. Furthermore, under reasonable assumptions of R and C being positive, and this term here, half A minus RC, would then be less than half an A, wouldn't it? If R and C is positive, we subtract something positive from half an A. So if we look at this one, it would be smaller than this one. And this is kind of interesting, isn't it? Because it means that this term here and this term here is smaller than these two terms. So if these two agents could have kind of negotiated the solution of not using drugs and actually follow that up, then they would end up down here, which is a nicer outcome for both athletes than this one. The cost of drug taking is eliminated, and you of course have the same price. Or actually you could perhaps argue that the price would increase if every spectator would know that nobody took drugs. It could be that more people would be willing to pay for looking at the event. Of course, it's the willingness to pay for looking at an event, even if it's on the stadium or on TV, that kind of basically is the content of this A, which kind of is paid back to the athletes. So it could actually be an even stronger prisoner's dilemma than we actually see here. Okay, that was the second one. Then if you look at the actual structure here, it says that a necessary condition for efficient anti-doping work. Efficient anti-doping work would be the opposite. In that case, we would have half an A minus RC being less than 0, and that would be no doping. Okay. Then we have a single unique Nash equilibrium down here. To achieve that, we can look at this inequality, obviously, or if we like, we can write it like this. Throwing RC on the right hand side and dividing by by C. We get that R must be bigger than A divided by 2C. Now, if you look at this term here, it kind of directly tells us how we can do anti-doping regulation. Either we could increase the R, make better tests, make more tests, test more athletes, or we can increase the C. Increasing the C makes the right hand side smaller, and it's easier for R to get bigger. Of course, increasing C means making penalties tougher for doping. For instance, one obvious thing to do would be to say, okay, if you have won 100 million crowns as a football player in the last 10 years, then you get caught in doping, then we assume that you have played by the aid of drugs up to this point, and we have to withdraw certain parts of what you have earned. Okay. Finally, this A can be increased. Okay. No, sorry, not increased. Decreased, of course. This A can be decreased. Okay. By decreasing A, again, this fraction gets smaller, and it's easier for R to get bigger. This is something which has been less investigated among sports officials. You probably know that most sports people may earn a lot of money when it comes to certain needle-eyes in sports. If you qualify for the Champions League, you get 100 million crowns and so on. So there is very big prices stepping upwards on the ladder here. And these big prices, of course, has a tendency to make anti-doping work hard. Okay, that's kind of what this says. So what you could do is to kind of divide money more evenly among competitors. That would actually have a positive effect on doping. A final point here, which is kind of obvious, is that anti-doping work should be strongly differentiated between sport activities. If the price in soccer is much higher than the price in curling, which of course it is, and this punishment cost is close to the punishment cost for the two sports, which in a sense it is. The fine or the number of years to be taken out of sports is almost the same between sports here. Then, of course, the consequence, given this inequality, is that this R soccer must be far bigger than R curling. Okay, so if you're interested in doing efficient doping prevention, you need to divide your doping tests unevenly between different sports. So if cross-country skiing is a risk activity, you should have far more doping tests there than you have in soccer. This seems to correspond reasonably with reality, doesn't it? There isn't that much doping testing in soccer. On the other hand, there's a lot in cross-country skiing. Okay. Moving on to some relaxations. Okay, one of the strong relaxations here, of course, is this assumption of equal strength. Okay, so we assume there are clones. Now let's open up for a non-cloning situation. So we assume that agent 1 is better than agent 2. And then again we have to make an assumption related to how this is formulated. And what we do here is that we say that agent 1 is better than agent 2 with a common knowledge probability P. This common knowledge term means that both agents here actually know this P. So they've been able to kind of monitor each other during some historical events, and agent 1, he knows that he will win against agent 2 with a probability of 75%. The same information is known by the other one. Given this assumption, of course this matrix changes. We have to add some p's in it somewhere, and it turns out there is a 1 minus p here and a 1 minus p here, there is a p there and a p there. Okay, this is kind of just simple logic related to computing expected payoffs for given this assumption. So what happens now? It says here in the DD and NDD and the ND cases, agent 1 beats agent 2 with probability P. the drug has still equal effect. Okay. In the ND cases, we still assume, to make things simple, that the drug taker wins with certainty. That is, the drug is magical. This magical drug concept is perhaps needs some further explanation. What I really mean here is that, recall we assumed previously that if one of these guys took a drug, he will win if the other didn't. And of course that was plausible given that they were equal. Now they are suddenly unequal. But what we assume here is that the drug is so strong that even if the better person doesn't take drugs, the other one will always beat him if he takes drugs. Okay? This is kind of important. So now, given this situation, of course we can analyze the game again, and it turns out, time is passing here. It turns out that okay, we can do it. Okay, agent 1 is better than agent 2. That leads to a situation where the original p over half is changed, isn't it? Agent 1 has a probability bigger than a half of beating agent 2, and consequently, if a half a minus rc is positive, which was our original assumption, then of course this new value, including the p, must be even stronger positive. Okay, the p is bigger than a half. Obviously, this term is even more bigger than rc than in this situation. Now, if you just add 1 minus p times a on each side of 6, we get this concept, and then we see that we kind of get an opportunity to fix two of the best replies. PA minus RC is now bigger than 0, so we get a circle around this. This is the best reply for agent 1, given the situation. And if we do the same for agent 2 here, we see that now this A minus RC is bigger than 1 minus P over A, so we get this square here. My terminology here is standard. I kind of maximize here for the first player, maximize on the line here, and on the line here for the second player to find the best replies and ultimately the Nash equilibrium. So now we have kind of established two best reply functions, so there are still two missing. Okay. It says here that the rest of the best reply functions are determined by the sign of the expression 1 minus p a minus rc. That's kind of obvious, isn't it? Because if we look at comparing this value with this value, it's the sign of this one which is interesting. If it's positive, it's bigger. If it's negative, it's smaller. It says here, if 1 minus p times a minus rc is positive, then of course you're back to the same situation as previous, because then that one is bigger than that one, and you get a square here, and you get a singular Nash equilibrium here. On the other hand, if it's the other way around, meaning that this one is smaller than this one, meaning that we get a square around the 0 here, and of course you also get, in that case, not a circle around here, but a circle around there. That follows directly from the math here. Then you end up in a situation, as it says here, with no Nash equilibrium in pure strategies. Hence, a unique Nash equilibrium in mixed strategies is the game theoretic prediction. So what does that mean? That means that we don't know whether the agents actually take drugs or not. What we know is that they kind of randomize on it. And of course, as it says here, consequently, regulation within the boundaries of this situation here is, in practical terms, if an athlete believes strongly enough in the magical effectiveness of a drug, doping cannot be fought. Remember, this magic effectiveness is kind of the underlying thing here. And given this assumption, then you end up with a Nash equilibrium in mixed strategies, meaning that you kind of lose any predictive power here. So then it's of course hard to fight drugs. Okay. The paper itself contains more information than this. There is some paragraphs related to repetition, some paragraphs related to incomplete information. There's even some talk here about whether this is a sensible game to look at. Of course, what we look at here is that there are two agents competing against each other, but there are obviously other agents which are relevant here. For instance, the decisions made by the sport officials. How is that linked into this? To my knowledge, this situation has up to today been loosely analyzed. That's why a paper lately on this, so there are somebody working on it. But whether it has found its form, yes, I'm really not sure. But you see, some conclusions here. Athletes' belief in magical drug is a problem in anti-doping work. work. So if the agents really believe that if we take drugs we can beat anybody, if that is kind of the information the agents have, then of course this is a strong incentive to take drugs. Furthermore, it says, hence increased uncertainty of outcome or increased competition is an interesting and not much discussed anti-doping strategy. If there are more than a single person who are good and can prove to be very good, of course then you get a situation where you, to a certain extent, even if you believe in a magical drug, cannot be sure to win. And of course, if you really take the risk of doping, you would like to maximize this probability of being sure on winning. So one way of kind of reversing here is to try to think that if you increase competitiveness within the sport, that could actually have positive effects on drug taking. Of course, these arguments, as it says here, may also serve as an explanation on why certain uncompetitive sports like athletics has more problems with doping than, for instance, soccer. Now, I say here that athletics is an uncompetitive sport. Probably some would react on that one, but compared to soccer, is definitely less competitive. Meaning that if you look at the field of 100-meter runners, it's more or less the same people running in all finals during, let's say, a 5-year period. Some would argue that that's the same in Champions League and soccer as well. On the other hand, and maybe that's correct, but at a level below the top level in soccer, there's a strong degree of competitiveness. As we briefly into here, the athlete's knowledge about doping and its effects may be important. If the athletes wrongly believe that the drug is magical, there's somebody coming up to him saying, okay, if you take this drug you'll be an Olympic champion. And should we say silly athletes kind of believes this and starts taking the drugs, of course he doesn't have to become an Olympic champion, but of course he may also be it. You probably all remember Ben Johnson in a certain Olympics who kind of ran very fast. So in a kind of, you could say that trying to make actual doping effects visible for athletes may actually be a good thing when it comes to fighting doping, because then you actually know how it works. You can look at it and you can perhaps take a more and better informed decision on whether to put it in your body or not. Okay, of course, to increase DC is an obvious candidate. As we already have discussed, there is some lacks here. I like to compare people taking a drug abuse in sports with a bank robber. Now, if a person robs a bank for a certain amount of money and he gets caught, of course, you have to pay all this money back, doesn't he? In addition to that, he may pay more money in fines as well as serving several years in prison. If you look at the sportsman taking in drugs, of course he keeps his ransom, doesn't he? His outcome from the robbery, all the money he has earned as a doper, still is his. He is locked out for sport for a certain period, maybe even on life, but still he is keeping the outcome from the robbery. And that is, of course, something which is not nice. If you really want to make the punishment work here, you definitely must make economic consequences for the agents. There is another important point here. Remember this inequality. We said we can increase R, increase C, or decrease A. Decreasing this A is an interesting thing. If you think about the situation with two athletes, this A kind of tells us what gets the winner and what gets the loser. In this case, in our case, it's simple. There's A to the winner and 0 to the loser. Of course, we can have a different division here. We could give a certain percentage of age to the winner, 90% to the winner, and 10% to the loser, for instance. That would actually have effect, wouldn't it? If we give the same to each, if we gave the same to each of them, whatever the outcome, there would be no doping. On the other hand, the interest for the competition would be very low. So this is a kind of a balanced thing. If you move to more than two players, of course, the shape of this so-called price function becomes important, because in a two-player situation, all these price functions will be linear. And the shape, whether it's progressive or digressive, for instance, doesn't make any relevant difference. But in the multiplayer case, it does. We'll return to this in a later talk. Finally, perhaps the most important point of all here, could it be that the sports industry has incentives not to fight doping? Of course, this is related to what we briefly talked about earlier on adding sport officials as a player in this game. As I said, I haven't done that yet, but some people have started working on it. The point is kind of simple. Sports audiences demand something from sports, okay? Sport officials want to maximize demand, okay? If you look at what sports audiences demand, they demand various things. They demand excellent. The faster you run, the higher you jump. The more demand, the more willingness to pay is there. But they also demand competition, so uncertainty of outcome is an important factor, along with other factors. But it's this first point here which is important. And we know that doping actually enhances performance. That is kind of the whole point here, isn't it? So if I prefer to see a 100-meter runner clock in at 9.5 instead of 10.5, if I'm willing to pay more for that, obviously there is an incentive among sport officials to accept some doping. On the other hand, doping has other negative effects, so again, there is some kind of balance. So given this, we can kind of talk of an optimal level of doping from an economic point of view. But I think this is enough for today. Okay. Hope I see you again soon.